My family cut me off for a decade, then came back begging me for $260,000. Here's what I did. I used to believe that if I just stayed quiet long enough, someone would eventually notice I existed. Not in passing, not as an obligation, but as someone who mattered in their world. That illusion shattered the night I turned 17, standing in a living room filled with guests I didn't recognize, smiling at a celebration that had my name on it, but never truly belonged to me. My name is Caleb. I'm 29 now, living in Austin, working in a mid-sized tech company where I lead a small software team. Life's decent, better than it ever was back in Fairview, Ohio, where I grew up invisible under the roof of people who claimed they loved me. I make good money, I live alone, and I answer to no one. But if you've ever had your entire bloodline pretend you didn't matter for years, then suddenly show up in your life again, smiling like none of it happened, then maybe you'll understand why I'm writing this. My younger sister Brielle and I were born on the same day, 2 years apart. She's the golden child, always has been, always will be. My parents loved the symbolism of shared birthdays when we were kids. It gave them an excuse to throw one party, buy one cake, and claim it was a family tradition. I never minded when we were younger. We got toys, sugar, and noise. But the older we got, the more obvious it became that the spotlight only pointed in one direction. By the time I was a teenager, it felt like every guest came to see Brielle, and I was just part of the furniture. That final birthday, the one I'll never forget, didn't start out differently than the others. Balloons, relatives, awkward hugs, but something about it felt colder, more orchestrated, like everyone was waiting for a moment I hadn't been told about. The living room buzzed with voices, mostly people I didn't know well. My parents had invited some extended family and old neighbors. My friends weren't there. I didn't invite them. I stopped doing that after I turned 13. I got tired of explaining why the cake never had space for both our names. I stood near the back window watching people laugh, holding plates of food, while Brielle worked the room like it was her wedding reception. She'd always had that easy charm, the kind that didn't need to be taught. My mother called everyone together, her wine glass raised like she was officiating something sacred. Everyone circled in. The lights dimmed slightly, and the candles on the cake flickered. She smiled, glanced at me briefly, then turned to Brielle and said, "You make the wish, sweetie. Your brother won't mind." Just like that, my role as the older sibling had been reduced to a formality. I nodded, because what else do you do when the choice is taken from you before you even realize there was a decision to be made? The candles went out under her breath, and the room clapped like it had witnessed something magical. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. This wasn't my night. After the cake, they cleared a space in the center of the room. Mom stepped forward with a white envelope sealed with gold trim. Dad stood beside her with his arm around Brielle's shoulder. "We've been working on this for weeks," Mom said with a tone reserved for wedding toasts or job promotions. Brielle opened it slowly, probably for dramatic effect, but I think part of her already knew. She pulled out the voucher and gasped. "Barcelona? I'm going to Spain." The room erupted. Some relatives clapped. Others started whispering, and I just stood there. Nobody looked in my direction. I don't think they even realized I hadn't moved. My father called it an investment in her future. He said travel builds character. Someone laughed and said, "What a gift." At 16, I said nothing. I didn't have to. This wasn't about me. She walked over a few minutes later, her arms full of gift bags, and handed me a thin box wrapped in blue paper. "This is for you," she said quietly. I nodded, peeled the paper back, and found a used laptop. The kind of high school might replace after 3 years of slow performance. It had a sticker from some law office on the back and a few visible scratches. I'd already saved up for a machine of my own, something faster, something mine, but I thanked her anyway. Then I sat in the corner, staring at the soft glow of party lights and thinking about how my name had never once been said without hers attached to it. Even now, I was just the other sibling. Later that night, I brought the laptop upstairs and placed it on my desk. I didn't turn it on. Instead, I opened my closet, pulled out the acceptance letter from a local university in Boise, and read it again. I had applied in secret, spent the last 2 years quietly gathering recommendations, scholarship applications, anything that would help me get out. I didn't need much, just a way out of that house. Tuition was steep, but I had a few grants, and I figured I could take on debt if I had to. But I knew that if I stayed, I'd rot from the inside out. The next morning, I asked my father if we could talk. I showed him the letter, told him I wanted to study computer systems and engineering. He barely glanced at it before asking, "Why not something practical, like finance?" I stood my ground. He shook his head. "I'm not paying 70 grand for you to play with code." That was it. No debate. Just dismissal. Like I was a temporary inconvenience. I took a breath, steadied my voice, and asked about the inheritance my grandfather had left. The one everyone knew was intended for the grandkids. "Brielle needs that money," he replied, flat and immediate. "She'll be the one taking over someday." He didn't even hesitate. It had already been decided. That moment, it didn't hurt the way people imagine heartbreak does. It just went silent inside me, like a door clicked shut and locked behind it. I stood up, nodded, and left his office. No shouting, no questions. It was already done. 3 days later, I packed a bag. A few clothes, some books, my own laptop. The old one they gave me stayed behind on my desk. I left a sticky note on top of it that said, "This was never mine to begin with." I took a Greyhound to Boise. I started classes the following week, worked nights at a gas station, and cleaned building lobbies on weekends. Nobody called. Nobody asked if I'd made it. Nobody cared. I checked my phone every night for weeks, thinking maybe someone would break the silence. They never did. And if you're wondering why I'm writing this now, it's because they came back. After 10 years of nothing, they showed up again. And not just for a visit. They came with smiles, hugs, stories, promises, and a number. A very specific, jaw-dropping number. They didn't return to say they missed me. They came because they were sinking. And now they needed the forgotten son. College was never about discovering myself or exploring some philosophical purpose like people talk about in graduation speeches. For me, it was just a path out, a clean break from everything I left behind in Fairview, from every forced smile at family dinners and every secondhand moment dressed up as tradition. I started over in Boise with $5,000 in a plastic envelope, a dorm room barely bigger than a storage closet, and a class schedule that felt like it was written in another language. The first few months were brutal. No safety net, no one to call when something broke, no one who'd notice if I disappeared for a few days. But the absence of anyone to catch me also meant I learned fast how not to fall. I kept my head down in lectures, worked graveyard shifts at a gas station where I saw more drunk arguments than I ever saw kindness at home, and cleaned office buildings on Sundays when most people were out pretending the weekend meant something. Some nights I slept 3 hours, some I didn't sleep at all. It didn't matter. I wasn't chasing a dream. I was buying my own freedom $1 at a time. Every paycheck went to food, rent, tuition. Nothing extra. No parties. No impulsive flights home. Not that anyone would have met me at the airport anyway. By the time I reached my final year, I had earned 2 scholarships, built a portfolio, and landed a part-time internship with a local tech firm that mostly handled outdated logistics systems for regional warehouses. It wasn't glamorous, but they gave me access to real work. I lived on black coffee and code, slept in libraries when I had nowhere else to go, and ate like a raccoon with a student discount. But I never once considered going back. Not even when the winter snow made the pipes in my dorm freeze for 2 days straight, or when I got food poisoning from a gas station sandwich and still dragged myself to class with a fever. I graduated at 23 with a degree and no audience to clap for me. I walked across that stage, took the fake diploma, and smiled at the echo of an auditorium filled with strangers cheering for names they didn't know. No one called. No text. No message. That was the day it truly clicked. They hadn't forgotten about me. They just decided I wasn't worth remembering. Still, that night, I let myself celebrate alone with a six-pack and a burger that cost more than I usually spend in a week. It wasn't joy, but it felt like something close to pride. The tech firm I'd interned for offered me a full-time position a few weeks later. Starting salary was just over $48,000 a year. Not much, but enough. Enough to get out of the dorms and into a one-bedroom apartment with working heat. Enough to begin paying down the student loans that stalked me like a second shadow. I took freelance jobs at night, building out e-commerce stores for local shops, streamlining systems for small businesses that couldn't afford real IT teams. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. I coded until my eyes blurred, until my fingertips ached, and every cent I saved went straight to my debt. I made my final loan payment 26 months after graduation. I didn't celebrate. I just sat on the floor, alone, watching the screen confirm the balance was zero. It was like exhaling for the first time in years. At 26, I moved to Austin. Bigger city, better weather, more opportunity. A friend of a former coworker recommended me for a back-end developer position at a growing firm. I took it and started rebuilding from there. I rented a modest house, nothing flashy, but it was mine. I bought it 2 years later with a mortgage that I negotiated myself. No help, no co-signer, just me, my credit score, and the ghost of every door that was slammed in my face growing up. I was still quiet, still private, still the person people assumed didn't want attention. But the difference now was that the silence around me wasn't loneliness anymore. It was control. Promotion came slowly but surely. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but I was always the one who made sure everything worked when things were falling apart. I got bumped up to team lead after delivering a high-stakes project 3 weeks early. My boss called me in her office and said, "You keep doing this. You won't be behind a desk forever." I nodded, thanked her, and left. That night, I didn't call anyone, didn't text, just cracked open a cold drink on the back porch, looked out on my tiny yard, and thought, this is how it's supposed to feel, calm, earned, and mine. Then 4 months ago, everything shifted. I was leaving work late one Friday, sky still fading from orange to blue, when I noticed two figures standing at my front door. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Margot in her pale blue coat, the one she only wore to funerals and fundraisers, and Leon standing beside her with his arms folded like a man expecting a negotiation. I hadn't heard their voices in over 9 years. I don't remember walking to the door. I just remember the click of the lock and how my hand didn't shake as I opened it. They smiled like I had just returned from a long trip, and they'd been waiting all along. "Hi, Caleb," Margot said, voice soft like she was trying not to spook a stray animal. Leon gave a stiff nod. I stepped aside and let them in. No words, no warmth, just the kind of courtesy you offer someone who used to mean something and now doesn't. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table I had built from a kit on a quiet Sunday afternoon last year. Margot glanced at Leon, then looked back at me and said, "Your cousin Brian told us where to find you. He said he drops by sometimes." I gave the slightest nod. Brian had visited once or twice. I never told him not to. She cleared her throat. "We've been thinking about you," she said. "We're sorry for how things turned out." I didn't respond. I wasn't angry, just removed, as if they were reading someone else's script in my home, under my roof, at a table they had no hand in building. After a few more hollow pleasantries, Leon said, "You've come a long way, son. It's good to see you've done well." His voice didn't match the words. I looked him in the eye and asked, "Why now?" He blinked, glanced at Margot, and said, "It's just time." 2 weeks later, Margot called. For the first time in nearly a decade, I heard her voice on the other end of my phone, not asking for a favor or checking on someone else, but inviting me. "Your birthday's next week," she said. "We're planning a party. The whole family's coming. It's time we did this right." I didn't say yes. I just said, "I'll come." I don't know what I expected from that night. Maybe some form of acknowledgement, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could stand in that house again and not fall apart. But deep down, I felt something shifting, something too quiet to be trusted. Because people don't just wake up after 9 years of silence and decide they've missed you, unless silence was never about forgetting and coming back was never about love. The first thing I noticed when I walked into that house was how little it had changed and how completely I no longer fit inside it. The smell of lemon polish and oven-roasted chicken still lingered in the corners like nothing ever happened, like a decade of silence could be wiped clean by air fresheners and place settings. Every table was crowded with food, every seat filled with relatives who hadn't said my name out loud in years, and yet they all greeted me like I'd just stepped out to grab coffee 10 minutes ago. I shook hands, returned awkward hugs, nodded politely when someone mentioned they always knew I'd make something of myself, and kept my mouth shut as people told stories about my childhood that barely involved me at all. For the first hour, I thought maybe I'd been wrong to expect another performance. Maybe they did just want to reconnect. Maybe people change. I even caught myself relaxing when Margot brought out the cake and it had only my name written in dark blue frosting across the top. No dual birthdays, no shared candles, no second name tucked in the corner. For a brief, ridiculous second, I thought maybe this was the start of something new, a small redemption. I sat at the center of the dining room table, the same seat Brielle used to take when she was the star of every gathering. This time, she sat off to the side. She smiled when I walked in, but it didn't touch her eyes. We nodded at each other like coworkers on opposite ends of a failed meeting. Everyone took turns offering compliments, none of which I believed. A few people asked about my job, but I noticed how quickly their attention shifted back to stories about themselves, as if they had to balance the spotlight to feel comfortable. Margot hovered around me the entire evening, making sure my plate was full, asking if I wanted another drink, keeping her voice gentle and sweet in a way I hadn't heard since I was 10. It was unsettling, too careful, like she was afraid that if I blinked the wrong way, I'd vanish again. It wasn't until the guests left, their coats draped over arms, voices fading into night air, that the energy in the house changed. The warmth drained from the room like someone had unplugged the heater. Margot gestured for me to sit on the living room couch, and Leon followed behind her slowly, as if what came next had already been rehearsed. I sat down without a word. I wasn't surprised. Not really. I had felt the shift the moment the cake came out and no one talked over me to compliment Brielle. I just didn't know what they wanted yet. Leon cleared his throat and looked at Margot. She nodded slightly. Then he turned to me with a seriousness I hadn't seen since the night I told him I was leaving for college and didn't ask for his blessing. "We need to talk," he said, voice lower than usual. "There's something going on, and we didn't want to bring it up on your birthday, but we can't keep hiding it anymore." I didn't flinch. I just looked at them, waiting. Margot folded her hands together, gaze heavy on the floor. "The business is gone," she said quietly. "It collapsed last winter. We tried to recover, but Brielle, she wasn't ready to take over. We lost more than we could afford." She glanced at Leon, but he said nothing. I stayed silent. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just tired. She kept going. "We mortgaged the house to try to keep things afloat, but the payments are falling through. If we don't come up with $260,000 in less than a month, we'll lose everything." And there it was. The number. The quiet, enormous shadow that had been lurking behind every hug, every glass of wine, every carefully placed compliment. I looked directly at Leon. So, the party, was that part of the plan? He blinked once, jaw tensing slightly. It wasn't about that, he said. We meant everything we said. But if you could help, the family could stay in this house. It was your grandfather's, after all. It means something. I nodded once. No sarcasm, no accusation. Just enough movement to signal that I had heard him loud and clear. Then I stood up slowly and walked toward the front door. Before I turned the handle, I paused. If Grandpa were alive, he'd know I was never anyone's backup plan. I didn't wait for a reply. I opened the door and stepped into the night, letting the silence fill the gap they had tried to cover with wine and nostalgia. 2 days later, they showed up again. Same door. No warning. No apology. They stood there like nothing had happened, like I hadn't walked out on them after they turned my birthday into a negotiation. I let them in because I wanted to hear what came next. I didn't offer drinks. I didn't tell them to sit. I leaned against the counter while they stood in the middle of my kitchen, looking around like it was foreign territory. After 10 minutes of silence, I spoke first. If you need the money that badly, sell me the house. Market price. I'll transfer the funds within 24 hours. No strings. Just a clean deal. Leon's face twisted before the words even registered. He took a step forward and slammed his hand on the edge of the counter. You think you can buy the house your grandfather built? After everything? I didn't respond. He shook his head, voice rising. Having you is the biggest mistake of my life. Margot gasped beside him, but didn't deny it. She didn't stop him either. I stood there for another moment, then straightened up and said the one thing I'd wanted to say for years. If I had the choice, I'd pick a father who understood that love isn't transactional. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just turned and walked out of the room, leaving them there with whatever dignity they thought they still had. A week later, Margot came alone. No makeup, no fake warmth, just her in a plastic folder clutched tightly under one arm. She stood on my porch, didn't knock, didn't speak until I opened the door. We'll sell it, she said. But we have one condition. We want to stay, just until we figure things out. I looked at her for a long time, not because I was considering it, but because part of me wanted to remember her like that, not in anger, but in honesty. I kept my voice quiet. It's too late, Mom. Then I closed the door behind me, slow but certain. There was no more pretending after that. Whatever performances they had planned, whatever apologies they thought might soften me, they all fell apart under the weight of reality. I wasn't the same kid who waited for his name to be called second. I wasn't the one watching from the sidelines anymore. And whatever they were trying to salvage, it had nothing to do with family. It was survival dressed as sentiment, and I had finally stopped mistaking the two. After I closed the door on Margot that afternoon, I didn't cry, didn't pace, didn't replay the conversation. I just stood there for a few minutes, breathing slowly, grounding myself in the silence of my home, this space I had built with years of quiet endurance and no help from anyone who now claimed to be family. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't even feel regret. What I felt was clarity, pure, unshakable clarity that I was no longer someone they could reach with sentiment wrapped in crisis. Whatever desperation had driven them to my doorstep, it was no longer my responsibility to answer. That night, I sat on my back porch, a glass of water in one hand, my phone screen dim beside me. I could still see the place where Margot had stood, framed in the soft glow of a porch light she hadn't helped install. The only thing I kept thinking about was how calculated everything felt, how they'd waited until my guard was down before making the ask, how they wrapped their collapse in the illusion of reconciliation. And even then, when they asked to stay in the house they wanted me to pay for, I realized they weren't really asking. They were expecting, because deep down, they still believed they had the right to my sacrifice. 3 days later, Brielle reached out. Not a call, not a message, a forwarded email. It was a breakdown of the debts attached to the property, labeled with legal terms she clearly didn't understand. At the bottom, a note: please consider helping for the sake of the family. You know this house means more than money. I didn't reply. I archived the email and went back to work, where I was managing a failing deployment that had more integrity than the people who once shared a roof with me. That night, I got a call from Brian. He was the only one I hadn't fully cut off. He didn't defend anyone. He just said, "They're falling apart, man. You really shook something loose." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't care what they thought I owed them. The next weekend, while I was reviewing audit logs for a project, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring out. It buzzed again and again. Then finally, a message came through. A photo, an old one. Me and Brielle, probably 10 or 11, sitting on the porch steps of the house in Fairview, popsicles in hand. No kapskin, just the image. Like nostalgia was currency, and that memory might buy their way back into my life. I stared at it for a few seconds, then deleted it without saving. The past wasn't a reason to go back. It was the reason I had left. 2 days after that, Leon called. I hadn't heard his voice since the night he told me I was a mistake. This time, his voice was subdued, slower, like he was rehearsing humility but didn't know how to wear it properly. He didn't ask how I was. Didn't even pretend. "We're ready to sign," he said. "Come by the house tomorrow. We'll settle everything." I didn't respond right away. I didn't say thank you. I just said I'd be there at 6. When I arrived, they were already waiting at the table, folders open, documents laid out. Pens ready like this was a business meeting and not the dismantling of a lie. No one spoke for a while. The only sounds were the papers being shifted, the ticking of the clock on the wall, and the weight of what none of us would admit, that this was the end of pretending we were ever one thing held together by love. Margot looked tired. Leon looked cornered. Brielle wasn't there. Her absence didn't surprise me. She was always the centerpiece until the room lost its shine. Then she vanished. As we signed, line by line, clause by clause, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, not even. Just a cool, detached sense of completion. When it was over, I slid the check across the table and said, "You have 2 weeks to vacate. After that, I'll change the locks." Margot didn't meet my eyes. Leon looked like he wanted to protest, but even he knew better. I walked out first. Didn't wait for them. Didn't say goodbye. 1 week later, I came home to find a package at my door. No return address. Inside was a photo album. My childhood in pieces. First day of school. Christmas mornings. Random candids. All curated to look like a scrapbook of care. Like they were reminding me of what I was walking away from. Taped to the last page was a handwritten note from Margot. "This is still your home, even if you can't see it." I didn't keep the album. I didn't even open every page. I left it on a bench near a neighborhood library with a note that read, "Free to whoever wants a secondhand story." A few days later, Brielle called me directly. I don't know how she got my number. Maybe Brian gave it to her. Maybe she pulled it from an old contact list. I didn't answer the first time. The second time, I picked up. Her voice cracked immediately. "I didn't know they were going to ask you like that," she said. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear the version of the story she was telling herself. I never meant for it to go this far. Things got out of control. I kept my tone even. "You cashed the inheritance. You mismanaged the business. You watched them erase me and never said a word." "What part didn't you mean?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I was scared. I waited. Scared of failing. Scared of not living up to everything they said I was supposed to be." I almost felt something, but it faded as quickly as it came. I ended the call with one sentence. Fear isn't an excuse to let someone else disappear. She didn't call back. I didn't expect her to. Whatever apology she was chasing wasn't for me. It was for the version of herself that needed to believe she wasn't complicit. The day they moved out, I didn't show up. I let the realtors handle the handoff. A locksmith came the next morning. I changed every lock, updated every alarm code, and stood in the center of what was now legally and physically mine. Not as revenge, not as conquest, but as proof that you can reclaim space. Not just walls and windows, but the right to exist without apology. Later that night, I sat at the dining table and ran my hands across the wood grain. This was mine, not just the house, the peace, the absence of noise, the clean break from expectation. I poured a drink, opened my laptop, and began clearing the last traces of them from my accounts. Old shared documents, emergency contacts, backup emails. By midnight, there wasn't a single trace of them left in anything I controlled. And just like that, the chapter ended. Not with screaming, not with slammed doors, just with silence, firm, final, and mine to keep. A few weeks after they left, the silence didn't feel like emptiness anymore. It felt earned, like a room finally cleared of all the dust that never belonged. I didn't celebrate. I didn't light a victory cigar or toast to my own resilience. I just lived. I went to work. I cooked for myself. I paid bills. I slept through the night without wondering if someone would reach out pretending they had just remembered who I was. And eventually, the tension left my shoulders, the weight behind my ribs eased. And for the first time in over a decade, I felt unburdened by expectation. Then Margot messaged me again. No long letter. No apology. Just one question. Can we come by for a visit? I didn't answer. I left the message unopened, not out of cruelty, but because I had already said everything I needed to say. Some things don't require repetition. Some closures are quiet on purpose. Months passed. I got promoted again, this time to head of product development. It came with a raise, a new office, more pressure. But none of that ever felt heavier than pretending to be part of a family that only remembered my name when the lights went out. I saw Brian once or twice more, grabbed a beer with him in the city. He didn't bring up the house. He didn't try to bridge the past. He just sat beside me like someone who understood what it meant to be split between loyalty and truth. Then, a week ago, Brielle sent a video. She looked thinner, tired, less polished than I remembered. Her voice was calm. She said she was starting over, that she was learning how to live without being the chosen one, that maybe it was better not being held up by everyone else's vision of who she was supposed to be. I didn't respond. I didn't even watch the whole thing. I just let it end mid-sentence and close my phone. Because whatever journey she was on, it wasn't mine to fix, support, or applaud. I don't hate them. I don't replay old conversations trying to win arguments that already died in silence. I don't wish them harm. I don't check their social media. I don't ask Brian for updates. What I do is wake up in a home that's mine, walk through rooms they used to own, and remind myself every day that forgiveness doesn't always mean return. Sometimes it's just choosing not to carry the weight of resentment anymore. If you've ever been in my position, fighting to be seen, learning to build alone, try not to break every time someone says family is everything like it's always been true for everyone, then I want to say something to you directly. You're not heartless for walking away. You're not cruel for drawing a boundary that no one else understands. You're not selfish for refusing to bleed for people who only remember you when they need transfusion. Family, when it's real, is unconditional. But when it's not, it becomes a debt you keep repaying out of guilt until there's nothing left of you. I stopped repaying it. I chose something else. And now I wake up free. Not famous, not rich, not surrounded by applause, but whole. Finally whole. Was I wrong for walking away? Was I wrong for refusing to buy back a bond they'd already sold? I don't think so. I think sometimes love, real love, means walking forward and not looking back, even if your name is still carved into the walls you left behind.